is Weighing the Dog by Billy Collins.
All right, so weighing the dog. It is awkward for me and bewildering for him.
as
That's
I
all right.
hold him in arms in the small bathroom.
Balancing our weight on the shaky.
But this is the way to weigh a dog and easier.
And training him to sit obediently on one spot.
With his tongue out, waiting for the cookie.
With pencil and paper, I subtract my weight.
From our total to find out the remainder that is his.
And I start to wonder if there's an analogy here.
It could not have to do with my leaving you.
Though I never figured out what you amounted to.
So I subtracted myself from our combination.
You held me in your arms more than I held you.
Though all those awkward and bewildering months.
And now we are both lost in strange and distant neighborhoods. So, Billy Collins, he was born March 25th, 1941 in New York City, specifically Manhattan. And when he was about 12 years old, he started writing poems and found a love. So since his first poem, he's published numerous books and poems. And fun fact about him is he was appointed and serves Poet Laureate of the United States. As Poet Laureate to the Library of Congress. And then he was appointed from 2004 to 2006 as New York's Poet Laureate. And his specific style of writing poetry is usually seldomly amusing. It's appreciative of the normal little things in the world. It has very simplistic yet strong language and distinct observations, along with unique design. There's Collins pictured on the right.
All right, so here's just some kind of context around when he was writing and just the literary movement of contemporary poems overall. So contemporary poetry is characterized as poetry that was written after the 1920s, even as late as the 1950s. And they also use a variety of similar literary techniques, some including symmetry, simile, imagery, etc. And around this time, the end of the literary movement known as the Harlem Renaissance occurred. So that was around kind of the time period up till the 1920s, and in came the contemporary literary movement. Along with these type of poems, a very popular type of contemporary poetry of the time was love poems, which is similar to the poem that we are discussing today. And some other poets that were popular at the time were Seamus Heaney and Richard Sire. So for the poem type, it is contemporary. So some characteristics that you can kind of use to help determine if the poem you're reading is contemporary is if it mainly is a free verse poem. So usually there is little to no rhyming, as you can see when we read it out loud. There might have been one line that could have kind of qualified as rhyming, but there wasn't many. And there's no specific metrical rhythm as well. They are typically very brief in length. As you could tell, it was only around 5 stanzas, so they're never too long. And they also tend to not follow a standard poetic structure, like we kind of talked about earlier in Mr. Spalding's class, where some poems follow the A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F structure. Kind of this didn't really fall in those type of lines. And in terms of Billy Collins specifically, he's known for his free verse poems, and inconsistent meter and unrhyming poems are essential to be considered contemporary, like I mentioned before. And this aspect of free verse also goes along with no regard for standard poetic design. He regularly continues lines without stopping, making his poems somewhat offbeat at times. while still consistency his own flow. And this modern randomized flow is typical for contemporary style poetry.
Some literary and sound devices that were contained within the poem were there's some allegory in line 7, quote, with paper and pencil, I subtract my weight. And there's a synodoche in line 15, quote, and now we are both lost in strange and distant neighborhoods. There is a paradox, quote, I start to wonder if there's an analogy here. It cannot have anything to do with my leaving you. That's lines 9 through 10. Then there's symbol, balancing our weight on the shaky blue scale, line 3. And then there's a rhyme at the lines 10 through 11. It cannot have to do with my leaving you, though I never figured out what you amounted to.
And I can go ahead and add something to this slide. So for the allegory, it's kind of known as like a sentence or phrase that has a bigger meaning overall. So while it says with paper and pencil, I subtract my weight, he kind of talks about in the poem that will go more into the meaning about how he found that leaving or like kind of taking himself out of the equation in a relationship is how he figured out what was best for his lover and how he realized his mistakes. And for the paradox that said, I start to wonder if there's an analogy here. It could not have anything to do with my leaving you. That kind of refers to the poem as a whole, kind of being a metaphor and a paradox. Talking about how that him leaving the relationship and like kind of leaving her behind helped him find out what was best for both of them and helped him realize more about the relationship as a whole and how she was better off without him. And it kind of contradicted himself in the poem by saying if there's an analogy there, because that's what the whole poem kind of talked about overall.
Did you talk about the scale?
You want to talk about the scale, Bradley?
Yeah, the shaky blue scale. What he means by that is the connection between him and the past lover he's talking about within the poem. It's a simple in the poem. Reality-wise, it's him, the dog, standing on the scale. But through that action, he reminisces on this person, and the scale is what had their combination and their total together. And taking himself off the scale or subtracting from their combination is no longer with them.
All right, I can explain the paradox. So the paradox here is that Billy Collins is referencing an analogy, and in the next line he says it cannot have anything to do with my leaving you. Where in fact in the final, I think 5 lines of the poem, he does talk about him subtracting someone out of his life. So that's the paradox there.
Okay, so the true meaning of the poem is about Bill Collins, or the narrator speaker, reminiscing on a past relationship, and through his past relationship, he referenced more than just weighing a dog, but a broken relationship. And in this poem, we see the dog as a symbol for his lover, or connection otherwise. Collins uses the first 2 stanzas in the poem to form an analogy between his relationship with his lover, and that it was much easier to measure the amount of love that they had for each other. Collins explains how he subtracted a person from his life. This past memory is arisen from the action of standing on a scale with his dog and subtracting his own weight to find the total. This in itself is an analogy. It's the main idea of the poem. He has subtracted this person at his own desire, and his new total is only himself. He reflects on the idea that he wouldn't have been here or wherever he is without this person. I never figured out what you amounted to until I subtracted myself from our combination. Lines 11 to 12. This expresses the difficulty for him to reflect on that person and their past. his own, whatever that says at the bottom,
His own actions are the hardest ones
his
to swallow.
own actions are the hardest ones to. Yeah, next slide. Meaning continued. We see many instances throughout the poem that are emphasized through his analogy between his lover and a dog and their relationship. One being that during the relationship and while they were together, the girl was willing to do whatever for the author and just expects love in return, sort of like a relationship with a dog. But after separating, he realized the significance that she had in his life. And to quote the poem, he talks about how the his past lover, or she, grasped him in his arms, and he never, in all the hard times, and he never returned the favor. So it's hard for him to look back on this. So it's seen that he regrets it significantly. The literary devices mentioned in the earlier slides also help bring the significance that dealt with personal connections due to the fact that many instances in the poem, while they all had a literary meaning, dealt with this relationship of the speaker and the connections that he once had in his life. And the fact that he is now without those personal connections, he realizes how important his lover was once. He started not thinking as much about himself. Meaning part 3. Relating this poem to the time movement that is placed, it fits the stereotypes that come to mind with contemporary poems. The flow of the poem did not include very much rhyming, which is more typically used by poets from other poetic movements.
The reactions to the poem. I guess I can start. So the first two stanzas are simple and seem to not have any underlying meaning. However, the final stanzas are much more obvious when it comes to having a message. The message was that of dealing with something that was striking from your life. Something interesting was line 9 of the poem that went, and I start to wonder if there's an analogy here. Line 9. This awareness of what was to come in the final stanzas was fascinating. Collins is clearly gifted at writing. He does a brilliant job making something as normal as weighing a dog into a deep, thought-provoking story. This connection of life and past relationship isn't your typical message. It made our group reflect on the beauty and meaning by seemingly typical things. Moving something that had an unforgettable impact on your life is what many people can relate to. And personally, for me, I quite enjoyed this poem. It was very simplistic, yet it was very deep, and I just personally thought it was a great work of writing.
And so for my kind of opinion, we agreed on this one overall, but specifically for me, I liked that he put a lot in the poem to make it like kind of think about his relationship. But and I thought it was kind of interesting that he used weighing a dog to explain that his relationship with his ex lover and how he realized that he had a negative impact on her life. But I don't know. I didn't really like. It was simplistic, but I just kind of thought it was too simplistic in terms. I didn't really just. I'm not a really big fan of kind of contemporary poetry. I like some more kind of complex, and it was kind of hard to find some literary devices within this one. I kind of follow poems that are more like have rhyming alliteration, just kind of those more kind of old fashioned, if you would say, type of poems. So I liked how this author expressed his ideas and the ways he used the literary devices, but I personally don't really like this style as much. So while it was a great poem, I personally just didn't really. I enjoyed reading it, but I didn't really like the style as much.
To go off both of you, I feel like the poem was simplistic, very short, not many literary devices, anything like that. But the meaning overall, it was more like a not a short story, but like a real short story. know? So I feel like throughout, I mean, the whole, even when he says the analogy, I thought that was real clever. He was talking about, or contradicted himself with the analogy, because it just showed that it wasn't really a hidden meaning. He was just putting the meaning out there. And through like the little symbols and stuff with the shaking blue scale and the connection he made between his dog and this past relationship, I think it really shows his true regret he had because, as you can see through like the last stanzas in the poem, he clearly has regret over what he did or has done to make that person leave his life or leave their life. So I think he, by the reminiscing on their past relationship, he's become more self-aware of what exactly um, he intends. I think the whole it just connected Black with the poem. You know.
Yeah. All right.
You got anything else to say, Ben?
Not much beyond that. I enjoyed it. While I do prefer rhyming because I feel like it flows better. I did appreciate the Collins's skill and his knowledge of English and writing. I did appreciate that in this poem, but yeah, those are my final thoughts. Does anyone else have anything?
To go back to the poem, I don't think we talked about this, but when he talks about it be him and his holding his dog, and it's real bewildering for him and the dog. I think that was another symbol or connection towards his past relationship because he could hold on, or that his past lover could hold on to him, and he could be bewildering or whatever, and he would still hold on, just like it says in the crazy months that she held him or he held him through the crazy times. So I don't know. I feel like the connections are very strong throughout this poem. It just wasn't, what an ordinary poem really looks like.
Andre, do you have anything else to say or?
I think you guys said it all.
All right, well, that concludes our presentation.
We're at 1740.